Please join me in welcoming Mary McAleese, the former President of Ireland, to the Literary and Scientific Society.
Hello. How are you all doing?
Good.
Oh my God. Doing okay? That's it.
Well, here Dr. Ahern, Dr. Mary McAleese, you're very welcome back to your university, Queen's University. This is where it all started. Obviously, Mary was the first female Pro-Vice Chancellor of Queen's here, and blazed a trail for many others to follow, and we're delighted to have her back here. This is a very important event because tonight is an event organised by students, for students, and I always find that these are the most important and key events that we have in the university. We're celebrating our 180th anniversary, not 120th, my goodness, it took 60 years away there. And the Litterific have been a key part of this institution for 175 years, so well done to everybody here who's kept the flame going over that time and kept debating and things going. I always remember my first debating event in Queen's way back in 1998. The person that came up from Trinity to debate against us was one Leo Radcar, and I always wondered what happened to him. But he was a law student at that stage, believe it or not, before he went to be a medic. And there used to be a phenomenal debate and culture here at the university, and we're delighted that it continues. As I said, Mary and her husband Martin are no strangers to Queen's University, an alumna and alumnus of this great institution. But Mary's also been a great friend to Queen's for many years and continues in an academic role as the Chancellor of Trinity in Dublin. And we have a great relationship with Trinity and continue to work with them on a range of many different initiatives as part of our Shared Island process. Obviously, Mary was a member of staff here. As I said, she was a Pro-Vice Chancellor and also the Director of the Institute for Legal Studies. And has left her mark here at the university. Her portrait is on what we call the Wall of Honour down in the Great Hall, alongside her contemporary Lord David Trimble, alongside our other Nobel laureate Seamus Heaney, and many others who've contributed to Queen's. She told me a story recently, which I think is a very good story to encompass how far we've come in the university, that in the Great Hall, all the great portraits that you see, all them portraits used to be portraits of men. Mary put the portrait of the founder of the university, Queen Victoria, back up on the wall at the very front of the university, which was starting a trend. And this great painting here, as you'll see, and this artist then also did a portrait of Mary and the late Queen Elizabeth, which now hangs in the Great Hall as well. You'll see that we now have a plethora of leading women who have made a contribution to this institution. The theme of Mary's presidency was building bridges. And I always recall in 1997, when Mary was elected president. I didn't get to know Mary and Martin until they were in Norris many years later, but I remember my mother crying at the news that Mary was elected president. And I remember this being a strange thing. I was 17 at the time, doing A levels, and I remember asking, what's the thing? And she said, she's one of us. She was from Northern Ireland, she was one of us. And my parents were standing, I remember them standing in our kitchen watching this event happened in Dublin Castle way back at that time. So it was a seminal event for all of us here in Northern Ireland that we had somebody from the north that was elected President of Ireland, not least a woman who had already blazed a trail in many different roles up to that point. But I think sometimes we forget about these key moments. A year later, we had the Good Friday Agreement. I started Queen's that September, and it was a very, very different place to what we have now. And we should never take for granted what's happened over the past 28 years. But I would hark back to Mary's election and to the change in government that happened in Dublin and in London at that time, and how that created opportunities for all of us. And during that time that Mary and Martin were in the Irish, they flew the flag in many different fronts, because there were people from a non-traditional background, many people from the loyal orders here, many people from the loyalist community, who got into the Irish and actually built up a strong relationship with Martin and Mary, who played a key role in building confidence within loyalist communities and within the peace process. And that is a phenomenal testament to both of them in terms of what they've done. And they're a great team, and I know that Martin won't mind me saying, and Mary won't mind me saying, the significant role that Martin's played behind the scenes here in terms of building community stability. So whether it's academia or public service, Mary's exemplified the values that lie in the heart of debate through engagement and dialogue, and she's had the courage to speak with conviction, and she continues with that courage and that conviction right up until the present day in terms of the commentary she continues to make around Irish life and society, which I think is a very important contribution. So we're privileged to hear her reflections. Again, I'm delighted that all of you students have organised this event and you have Mary here this evening. So ask her plenty of hard questions and she'll be ready to answer them, and let's look forward to a lively debate. But Mary, Martin, thank you for being here this evening.
Thank you.
Dr. McAleese, I would like to extend my thanks, I think not only on behalf of the Litterific, or the Gown, but I think the university itself. It's a real privilege to be having you here. So I'd like to start. I'd like to start with. I would like to start.
Daniel, I think if you just speak loud.
Yeah. Oh,
If Daniel speaks loud.
Can you speak all right? Yes. So I would just like to start with your career prior to being president. You became president in 1997, just at the end of the Troubles. You started your career roughly at the start of the Troubles, so your working career prior to the presidency went across that period. What insight did you gain, say, working north and south during the Troubles, whether it be as a barrister, as a journalist, or as Pro-Vice-Chancellor of Queen's, that formed your commitment to reconciliation?
I think my interest in reconciliation goes back before I came to Queen's. I was born and reared not far from here in Ardoyne, where 70% of the people in Ardoyne were unemployed. It was a poor parish. It was and became the place with the highest incidence of sectarian murders in Northern Ireland, bar none. It's still the place where if you go up that road that I was born and raised on, you still have that massive wall to keep one side of the community from encountering the other. I was lucky that encountering the other wasn't a problem for me. My parents were country people. My father was from the west of Ireland, from Roscommon, where we now live. My mother was born in Mahara, but was actually from the Mournes. Her people were from the Mournes. And they really didn't know enough when they were buying their first home. And they landed us as the only Catholics into what was a so-called Protestant street. And that turned out to be the best thing that could have happened to us, because unlike most people then in Northern Ireland, we weren't ghettoised. Over 90% of people in Northern Ireland lived in areas that were defined by religion/politics. We weren't. And that helped because it meant that I grew up, although I went to Catholic schools, being from a so-called Catholic family, I wasn't meeting my friends in school, but I was meeting them on the street and in the street. And so I grew up with a plethora of Catholic and non-Catholic friends. And that gave me an insight into what life was like within the Protestant community. Our next door neighbours, for example, who became great friends, all our neighbours obviously were Protestant, so we knew that some went to First Presbyterian, some went to Second Presbyterian, some went to the Gospel Hall, some went to Methodists, some went to other varieties of Methodism, Protestantism of all sorts. And that's where I learnt about the existence of those all sorts. Catholics, of course, all converged in the one church, or the one chapel. So, and then listening to because we were all quite politically conscious, can I say? Our next door neighbours, who were our great friends, we holidayed with them, we shared holiday homes with them. They were very hostile to the Orange Order, for example. Other people in our street were up to their ears in the Orange Order. But somehow we had a kind of a snapshot of Northern life in very differentiated kind of colour. And so it wasn't the binary that is often presented. And I grew up with that absence of binary, which I think was helpful. I also grew up with my father's best friend, for example, where we lived, we moved 5 times in Ardoyne, mainly because my mother had 11 pregnancies between the age of 20 and 38. And so the family kept growing and outgrowing each home. And our last home, which was in the front of the Crumlin Road next door to a school then, a Protestant school called Everton School, where a lot of my friends went, our neighbours, we had 4 ministers of different Protestant denominations who were our immediate neighbours. One of them, my father's best friend, whose son is now the Dean in St Anne's Cathedral in Dublin. And he was in our house maybe 3 nights a week. We're talking about the 60s. Nobody here except Martin and I will remember the 60s probably. But this was a time of, post the Second World War, the mess that was the Second World War, the disaster of millions and millions of dying in Europe. We had the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the United Nations, the European Union. These were all great adventures, both in democracy, in human rights, and in setting an agenda for peace and for diplomacy and for, if you like, global engagement that would hopefully secure peace. And as we see, it had weaknesses that still remain to be organised better, put it that way. So we grew up at a time of great hope, and within the Catholic Church system that we were educated in, it was a time of the Second Vatican Council and ecumenical relations, because the churches had been the Christian churches, God forgive them, had been so frosty with each other, and now there was a kind of a thawing. And so our neighbour, this wonderful, wonderful Church of Ireland neighbour minister, he used to come in and they talk politics and they talk church politics and share a small glass of whiskey every evening. So I grew up I'm always so grateful that I grew up in that environment and not in one where it was easy to other the others. It was very difficult because I grew up in the place where these were friends. I couldn't other them, nor could they other me, with the result that, all the way through my years in Queen's, in school, I came here in '69, do the maths, and with my husband, to whom I am married 50 years today, and I'm a saint, I know. As he would say, yeah, and he's remarkable. And it was a good decision. We both walked into the checkerboard hall on the same day, at the age of 18, full of enthusiasm for this place. And I'm so grateful also that I came here, because we had both been on the debating circuit, at that time, both in our own respective schools, but more importantly, across the schools. So by the time we came to Queen's and by the time I came to do law, many of the students who were here from other schools, state schools, Protestant schools, some Catholic schools, we already knew them all from the debating circuit. And again, in the foment of the time, the politics of the time, we had to learn how to befriend each other and how to stay friends. So I'd always been involved with things ecumenical, things cross-community. That was my life, and I also was utterly hostile. Very hostile to the use of violence for the accomplishment of political ends. The great heroes in my family, my father left school at 14, my mother at 15. My father was a barman, my mum was a hairdresser. But I'll tell you something, whatever education my father got, it was a good one. And he had a great interest in history, local history, Irish history, and he had some great heroes. And one of his greatest heroes was a man called Daniel O'Connell. Those of you who are lawyers, those of you who are interested in history, will know something about Daniel O'Connell. His statue stands at the Liffey end of O'Connell Street. He was the man who introduced the idea of human rights and democracy to Westminster. Doesn't get a lot of credit for it, but he was. He had been a student in Paris when the revolution broke out, and that turned him off violence for life. He saw when that genie's out of the bottle, you try putting it back in again. We saw that here in Northern Ireland. It's easier to start a war than it is to end a war. And he became really adamantly certain that the best way to solve political difficulties was through dialogue, no matter how hard it was, and it was through democratic politics. And he was also, if you like, the Nelson Mandela of his time. He was famous all over the world. Why? Not because he was a great, and he was the architect of Catholic emancipation, because Catholics at that time, of course, were excluded right across the United Kingdom from virtually everything, including from being barristers. He was very lucky that changed just as he was coming into adulthood, so that he could become a barrister. But voting and all of that and top jobs were all lost to them. Not just to them, but to Presbyterians, sometimes forgotten. So he was a champion of Presbyterian emancipation, Catholic emancipation. He was a champion of Russian Jews who were appallingly treated as third-class, fourth-class citizens. He was a great champion of African American slaves. And so he was known all over the world for his championship. I grew up in a home where he was the star. He was the lodestar, and he was my lodestar. He was the man who wanted a reconciliation between the two traditions in Ireland that had been, a long time in the making. That those who wanted freedom for Ireland, those who wanted human rights for the majority Irish population, which of course the penal laws had denied them, and colonialism and imperialism had denied them. But he wanted the tradition that would fight against the British using violence to be reconciled with the tradition that said, let's argue our case, which is a good case and an honest case, let's argue it democratically. Now, he knew that arguing it democratically was a long-term thing, but on the other hand, he also knew that violence just made people more raw, more angry, more frustrated, more vengeance-driven, and prolonged the day when you could have reconciliation. So I grew up in that kind of household, thankfully. And that's where my theme for building bridges, it sounds like a cliche, but when I became president, I knew that that was an urgent thing to do. Because here in Northern Ireland, the relationship between the two traditions, as they're called, was not good. The relationship north-south was not good. And the relationship east-west between Dublin and Westminster was not good. They weren't healthy. And I believed they could be healthier, and that my job as President of Ireland was to try and make them healthier. So that's what we did. So that's where building bridges came from. It was of the direct experience of growing up in a very fragmented society where a lot of people had chosen the path of violence rather than the path of peace. And I thought that was a zero-sum game. I still think it's a zero-sum game, no matter where it's played out in the world. I still believe that diplomacy and democratic debate is so much more humane and civilized and decent.
Thank you very much. So on building bridges, so the 5 years after your presidency, two pretty big events occurred with the UK with Brexit and with the US with the election of Trump, kind of isolationist political movements. Do you think that is an obstacle to building bridges, and how should Ireland today sort of work with Britain and America, even if they're becoming more isolationist, to build bridges?
Yeah, I think those are really very profound questions for this generation and the coming generations. When I was growing up, right until relatively recent times, up to Brexit, we had had a difficult relationship with Britain, of that there was no doubt, but from 1973 onwards, joint membership of the European Union had transformed the thinking landscape, but not immediately, because we had Margaret Thatcher to go through. And so we had that to get through, but incrementally, we joined the European Union on the same day. Small nation, bigger nation, but now sitting as equals around the European table. And of course, English speaking, little by little, you could see the beginnings of a really very healthy rapprochement between not just British and Irish politicians, but across a lot of levels. Industry, trade unions, they were all meeting, agriculturalists, they were all, and students, educationalists, researchers, they were all converging on the European Union and in the European Union, and they were all on speed dial to each other a few years later. I think we often talk about the relationship between Tony Blair and Bertie Ahern, which of course solidified in 1997. They were both elected just before me in 1997, so that was a happy coincidence, really. They gelled, and that helped with the Good Friday Agreement. But we also have to understand, and sometimes forgotten, before that, John Major and Albert Reynolds, who had both been finance ministers of their respective countries, got to know each other very well through the European Union. And their friendship was solid. It was so solid that when John Major found himself unable to deliver what he would like to have delivered in terms of relationship with Ireland, in terms of the troubles, as it were, he was in a situation where he didn't have a majority. He was pretty much in hock to unionism in the Parliament, so he had to be careful to traverse those relationships, and that never diluted his friendship with Albert Reynolds. And the fact that they met, that they liked each other, that they said nice things about each other, it kind of changed the temper of sort of post-Thatcher relationships, which had not been good. And they were able to, and it was interesting because it was recalibrated at a difficult time. And what recalibrated it was the manifest respect they had for each other. And so that was a good thing for Bertie Ahern and Tony Blair to build on. They were both pragmatists, and that helped enormously. And so we were fortunate, but then we still had a lot of work to do. When I came into office in 1997, we still hadn't got the Good Friday Agreement. The DUP were still outside the agreement 6-7 years later. They had to be brought in. We still had things like decommissioning. We still had the delivery of a community police force, the transition from the RUC to the PSNI. Those were all monumentally big things. And so there was a lot of work still to be done. Incidentally, the biggest problem that I saw at that time was that the trade border within the European Union, with the least concourse, the least things happening across it, was the land border here on the island of Ireland. And frankly, that was just stupid. That was really just stupid. Why? Because Northern Ireland had stuff to sell, goods and services. The Republic had goods and services to sell. We were the nearest to each other. You know, we could reach each other by land. We didn't have to stick stuff on planes or on big boats. So, but we didn't. Why? Well, it was the gravitational pull of history, really. And so we had to get over and there's a lot of vanity, both ways involved in that. There was also a lot of fear, and there was a lot of, I would say, mutual ignorance. We just didn't know each other well enough. And even though we were next door neighbours, that's one of the things I learned early on, that just because you live next door to people doesn't mean you know them. You might think you do, but you don't. And to know them, you have to sit around and have the cup of tea and the scone, and you have to talk. You can't live your life thinking you know them just because you happen to grow up next door. So we started to invest in that and learned very quickly about the work that had to be done. It really had to be done. And then, luckily, we had planned from very early on that one of the most important things that would sort of cement the relationship that was evolving, a good, healthy relationship on the East-West Forum, was to invite Her Majesty the Queen to the Republic. No monarch had ever set foot in the Republic of Ireland. There had been no monarch in that part of Ireland for over 100 years. And I knew that she wanted to come. I had discovered that while I was Pro-Vice-Chancellor here and had met her in that context, the context of the 150th anniversary of the Queen's Colleges, which were Galway and Cork and Ireland, I beg your pardon, and Queen's. And they had all been Island of Ireland Queen's Colleges that all eventually went their own way and became universities in their own right. But we had a joint 150th, and we had it in St James's Palace, which is where I met her for the first time, and then met her a few weeks later as a result of that first meeting, and learned from her that she really wanted to come to Ireland. She wanted to be part of the peace process, was trying to find a way to do that. So eventually we did. She came to Ireland in 2011. But unfortunately, and that was a brilliant event. I thought it healed a lot of history. Insofar as you can heal history, I think it did. It cemented, I feel like, a new iteration of the relationship on the East-West axis. But Brexit was undoubtedly difficult for that. I just put it in one word: betrayal. That's how I felt. It was a betrayal of the Good Friday Agreement, because the people who pursued Brexit were frankly clueless about the Good Friday Agreement, the cost of it, how many thin lines and threads were holding together, and I think it was a great betrayal. And also, it was just I thought it was a monumentally stupid in terms of economics, as it has proved to be. And I'm teaching in a university in London at the time, and I didn't intend to ever get involved in the Brexit campaign. But when I saw how it was going, and it was likely going to be lost, the anti-Brexit campaign was going to be lost. It was a time of shibboleths, and I'm an academic. I like the research. I wanted the 160-page white paper on Brexit, and it didn't exist. It was shibboleths, we'll take the European money back, and we'll take our borders back, and I knew that that's not the way life works. I also didn't like the Prime Minister. I had no respect for him whatsoever, or his successor. I just say that quite boldly. I just thought they were the stupidest people on the planet. So that was a dreadful time. And my husband and I got involved in campaigning against Brexit. And a very telling day for me, we were in the Irish Embassy, and I was very distressed by the fact that quite a lot of Irish people living in Britain were probably going to vote for Brexit. And we were trying to reach out to that constituency to point out all the things that had not been pointed out by those who were arguing for Brexit. But I was sitting like this in the embassy with a big audience with Dan Mulhall, who was our ambassador at the time, fantastic ambassador. And he said a very telling thing that just hit me like a ton of bricks. He said, as we're sitting here today, this is pre the referendum, in Brussels today, there are 27 meetings taking place in Brussels today, that one day, that involve the Irish representatives and the British representatives. And they're meeting across, he went through a whole list of stuff that they would be discussing, of mutual interest. And they will all know each other, and they'll all be engaging with each other, and they'll be arguing about things, but they'll also be working towards consensus on things where it's possible. And he said, when Brexit happens, that will fall away. That'll just all disappear overnight. And I thought that network of communication, those conduits, regular, every day, every week, from 1973, were producing such a wonderful set of relationships and figures economically, because Ireland was really beginning to do very well now as a result of that, but also politically. The engagement with all those other 27 European countries in our case, and in Britain, all those relationships were profoundly healthy. and they were all going to disappear, and they, overnight. And I was saying to myself, what on earth is going to replace them? Now, actually, we were lucky that we had the Good Friday Agreement, which built in certain, relationships across the three strands, but none of them were ever going to replicate that level of engagement. But at least we were going to have some of it. And so I've always thought that was a terribly trying time, of course, Brexit took a while to come into operation. And God knows it sucked the oxygen out of Europe trying to get all that and wrecked the career of one of the best prime ministers, in my view, a female prime minister, in my view, who actually had done a good deal with Europe, which if it had gone through, I think would have saved us a lot of angst, a lot of anxiety. That's Theresa May, in case you've forgotten her, because a lot of people seem to have. She was a good prime minister. She got a good deal if she'd been let do it, but of course then at that time, unfortunately, the DUP pulled the plug from under her and she was gone, unfortunately. And then we had, if you remember, maybe some don't remember, but back in the 1990s, before the Good Friday Agreement, we had the evolution of the Single European Act and the Customs Union. They totally transformed relations on this island. Totally transformed them. Suddenly, along with the demilitarisation that happened along with the Good Friday Agreement, we became borderless. And the only way you knew you were crossing the border was Vodafone kept telling you, they kept pinging you, saying it's going to cost you more. But that was a golden time because we were all members of the European Union. We were working to the same. Now, we had two different constitutions, obviously, and two different jurisdictions, two different sets of laws, two different parliaments, all of that. But there was an ease because we were members of the European Union and we were members of the Single European Act, Single European System, and the Customs Union. That was honestly, I think that was a golden era, which we are sort of struggling to get back to, though, the Windsor Agreement takes us a good bit of the way, possibly not all the way, but a good bit of the way. And I'm hoping, for example, that Keir Starmer, who seems to be on a road somewhere veering towards at least the Single European relationship again, as other countries have. Norway has, Switzerland has, with the European Union, and it's a happy enough relationship. I honestly think that that's where we have to get back to, and the fact that we did have it, and it was good, and it was healthy, and for me, it also helped to facilitate the Good Friday Agreement. The fact that we had those relationships. So, Brexit and post-Brexit has been very difficult, but on the other hand, we now have a government that, with Keir, and God knows, I don't know how that man sleeps at night with all the things that have been heaped on him since he became Prime Minister, including the current situation with the United States and with the war on Iran. But he has been very helpful in ameliorating relationships post-Brexit with Europe, which were not good, and with the Republic, and that's all healthy. And I think that where governments are talking to each other, that's healthy. I mean, we have a big debate going on at the moment about in Ireland about the annual presentation of the bowl of shamrocks to an American president, and whether it should happen or not. And my view is very simple. Look, you cannot look at that in isolation. You simply cannot look at that in isolation. You have to look at it as part of a massive panoply of engagement with Ireland right around the world, which is really good. We haven't really fallen out with anybody, thankfully. We didn't colonise anybody, thanks be to God. We didn't imperialise anybody. We managed to stay out of all that stuff. I mean, and what is more, places that were colonised and imperialised kind of understand us and our subversive sense of humour. And so we're very fortunate in that regard, that we're well regarded. So Many of our ministers will go all across the world. You know, the Colosseum will be lit up green on St Patrick's Day. The Empire State Building will be lit up green, and you know there'll be all sorts of green stuff will happen to do with Ireland, and it's a healthy thing. And we have a huge Irish diaspora in the United States who would be scandalised, even if they don't like their president, they'd still be scandalised if we don't turn up with the bowl of shamrock. And I think we should do it. And it's the right thing to do because it's a sense of continuity and fidelity to our people and our diaspora. For example, we were in Japan, Martin and I were in Japan one year on St Patrick's Day, and we were in Tokyo, and the equivalent to the city centre, sort of to Grafton Street in Dublin, is a street called Omotesando Street, where you have like Prada and Gucci and Louis Vuitton and all these very posh shops, and they close it down on St Patrick's Day for the St Patrick's Day parade. It's quite remarkable. And it's a very elegant parade, as you would imagine, in Japan, very elegant. And we were completely taken with it. But in the afternoon, at the event, we met diplomats from other countries, one of whom said to me, when I came here and discovered the Irish got, their national day, they got a Omotesando Street, I thought all I had to do was ask for my country. And he said, I was told, no, you're not getting a Omotesando Street. And they said, but the Irish get it. And the answer was, yes, and your point is? So we're very well got in Japan. The Empress, the previous Empress and her husband, she was educated by Irish nuns, as it happened, and they have a very Irish version of Irish history. And look, it was pointless for this other country even to bother asking. And that happens all over the world. There are Irish parades in places you wouldn't expect. Why? Some of the time you don't know. And some of the time it's got to do with Irish history and it's got to do with the Irish diaspora. But it's a good and it's a healthy thing. And it's opened us up to other places, and it opens other places up to us. And I think we work on that and we build on it. And so we've been very fortunate to be in. We've been in Australia for St Patrick's Day, in Sydney for the great parades, and you'd just be so proud to belong to a country that is actually so well regarded and that keeps that continuity. I would not like to see it broken, even at the moment where people have, and are right to have, serious concerns about what's going on in the White House, claiming jurisdiction or wanting jurisdiction over Greenland, initiating a war without UN backing in Iran, and of course then Iran responding by opening war fronts, it seems, entirely all over the Middle East. So yes, people are entitled to have misgivings, but in all those misgivings, I go back to Dan O'Connell, and I say, what would he have done? He'd have argued for holding on to whatever threads of democratic engagement still exist. Hold on to them. Keep them as healthy as you can until you reach a time when they get stronger. Because God knows we need them to be stronger, not weaker.
Yeah, I think Varadkar last week said that was a tough job that the Taoiseach will have going into
yes,
the White House.
Everybody who's gone into the White House recently has found themselves, in a predicament.
Yes.
How do you react to a man who is so labile? And that is very difficult.
Mm-hmm.
It is. We're not used to presidents who use such language. We're not, who's so bombastic. And so that is very, very difficult, and it is hard to maintain the elements of diplomacy. And yet people have managed to do it. I think of one of the great Democrats of our time, the great leaders of the Western world is Mark Carney of Canada, who really stepped up to the plate in Davos. One of the best speeches made in the 20th century. Read it. You know, it's the future. It's the future that we want and that we have to commit to, and we have to stand our ground. At the same time as sitting in the White House and, you know, and smiling through the stuff. And yes, I would recommend to everybody to read his speech, because it's what we need to be saying and hearing and holding on to through these difficult times.
Thank you very much. Just one last question I would like to get before I open up to the audience. Another issue of rights you've been focusing on, certainly since your presidency, is within the Catholic Church. So you earned your doctorate in 2018 in canon law, and you've been spoken quite openly about certain issues. You said that some teaching in the Catholic Church is rancid and in need of updating. Could you elaborate on what changes you think are most necessary within the Catholic Church for human rights?
Well, how long have you got? A lot. I mean, you're dealing with a code of canon law. The Catholic Church has a universal legal system, one of the first universal legal systems ever developed. But it wasn't codified until 1917 for the first time. I mean, it had literally at that stage built up 1,500 years of its own form of common law. And then it codified it in 1917. And the minute it codified it, it realised, oh God, a lot of this stuff is awful. Because in codifying it in 1917, it didn't change it. It just like took it into a big barn that was the code. And they quickly, and of course it was all in Latin, and Latin still being its primary language, its first language. And so from 1917 onwards, it was always going to be in need of reform. After the Second Vatican Council, the process of reform started, and we had the 1983 Code, which was a bit of an improvement in 1917, but not a great improvement. At the very least, though, mind you, at least it became available in English, which was something. But unfortunately, they carried through teachings and attitudes and perspectives that were pretty old-fashioned. It's an imperial system still, hierarchically an imperial system. Hierarchically misogynistic system, which excludes women at a very early stage, even though the church is 1.4 billion people in the world. It's the biggest NGO in the world. It does good work, but also it does great work, in fact. I mean, in terms of teaching the poor, offering, respite to the poor in terms of hospitals and welfare and education. I got a good education thanks to the nuns and the Martin too, the Christian brothers. I would give them all of that, but down that same conduit came stuff that needs to be updated and reformed. My criticism wasn't waiting for me to get a doctorate in canon law, believe you me. It started for me many years ago when I was a student here. And I was always very deeply involved in church activity, very conscious of the fact that, as I often said, that I grew up as a Catholic in Northern Ireland. Catholics didn't have the vote. So that was, on the one hand, we're hit by that, and it was in those days, the early days, Protestant Parliament for Protestant people and all that stuff, which is now long gone, thankfully. But and so I got that on one side, and on the other side, women can't be X or Y in the Catholic Church. So I was getting it in stereo, and that was informing me and informing my thinking. And when I came to Trinity in 75 to teach, 1975, I joined the staff in Trinity College. And one of the first people, and I was my criminal law was my thing, but one of the first people that I made friends with was a guy called David Norris, Senator David Norris, great champion of gay rights, and starting the campaign for gay rights. And he came to me because a number of people were being investigated by the police, and a number of people in the gay community, and what would be done and what could be done. And I said to him, what you really need is a campaign that involves heterosexuals as well as gay people. It has to be based on a human rights platform and a civil rights platform so that you draw in the widest audience. So out of that conversation came the campaign, what we call the Campaign for Homosexual Law Reform, which at that time, remember, was about changing the law that criminalised homosexual activity. And so I started in 75, and that was not exactly, consonant with Catholic teaching, to put it mildly. And so my view then was, as it had been for quite some, and even back then I had been critical of the Church's teaching on women, which excluded women from effectively all decision making, because of course decisions were, well, the so-called magisterium of the Catholic Church, that's the bishops. If you read canon law, it says that Catholics have to obey the teaching of the magisterium, which is they have to trust the magisterium and obey their teaching. Well, there's a whole lot of stuff that I couldn't possibly obey. No, thank you. I'd have to be, and I'd want to be able to use, thank goodness, the human rights, which were acknowledged in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, that never made its way into Catholic canon law, regrettably, yet. And, freedom of speech, freedom of conscience, freedom of expression, freedom of opinion, freedom of religion, and freedom to change religion, all identified as inalienable human rights that belong to everybody. Nobody can take them from you. People do try, governments try, institutions try, canon law tries, but they are inalienable. So you have to keep fighting for them. You have to keep arguing. And so, from I was a student, I was strongly opposed to the Catholic Church's teaching that excluded women from being ministers, for example, or being priests. I was very strongly opposed from my days when I came to Queen's. Back in 1972, I went to the United States, and I was so naive. I didn't know there was such a thing as homosexuality until 1972. Yeah. And I was working in a place where I had a gorgeous boss. Oh my God, he was gorgeous. And he and I became great mates. And another lady that I worked with said to me, don't think you should be falling for him now. And I said, why? And she said, because he's gay. And I said, I know he's lovely. I didn't know gay men. I was so naive. And he and I became great friends. And he explained to me what it was like to be a gay man. Even in San Francisco in the 1970s, you had Haight-Ashbury and all that, but he explained he'd been excluded by his family. He was the most lovely, genuine, decent person, and the hurt that was in him really got to me. And when I came back, I thought, this is a human rights issue. So a couple of years later, when I went to Trinity and became friends, of course, with David Norris, I was ready to push that issue as well. And so, as it happened, many years later, when my son, I have one son, two daughters, one son, but my son is gay. And, I laugh when I read people, and I particularly church people, saying, oh, she only became involved in gay rights when her son declared himself gay. Actually, my son was born in 1985. I was involved in the gay rights movement from 1975. I was the first person ever to articulate publicly that the campaign would also eventually include the demand for gay marriage. And at that time, there was so little reaction to it. I mean, I remember saying this on radio in 1977, and people regarded it as so risible that they didn't even bother to react. But then, of course, all those years later, 40 years later, we get gay marriage. And I did mention that to my son, who thought that, he was heavily involved in the campaign, of course, very successful campaign. But that campaign was 40 years in the making. And there was all that dialogue and the intergenerational dialogue. And then building up to what happened in 2015 when we had the same-sex marriage referendum that was so successful. And dialogue brought that about. People telling their story, particularly people like David Norris, who were so courageous. Leo Varadkar telling his story, so courageous. And that it needed to be, people needed to be generous too, to respond to that. And so I know that there's a great generosity in people. When I left office in 2011, I became a student again, as you said, of canon law, and I have remained a student ever since. I write in the field of children's rights and obligations in the Catholic Church, and of human rights in canon law, which is like a slim volume. And but I believe there's a huge amount of work to be done, precisely because the Catholic Church is such a key influencer in the world. The only religious denomination to have permanent representative status in the United Nations. Now that might mean nothing to this audience. Believe me, it is hugely influential. It operates in 5 continents. It runs 200,000 schools. It educates 80 million children. And it has 300 million child members, as well as between 300 and 400 million child members. By any stretch of the imagination, it is a key influencer. And it influences perceptions and attitudes and laws, and has done historically. So if you want to change things, you stay, in my view, I stay with it and I argue from within. And one of the reasons I went and studied canon, well, I had studied, in fairness, before I left office, I already had a master's degree in canon law. So I went then to Rome to gain what is called a licentiate. That's kind of the professional. Why? Because I wanted to write in the area, and I didn't want anybody to say to me, what do you know? I wanted to be able to have the academic credentials. That's the academic in me. And then I stayed on in Rome, and I did a doctorate in canon law, and I wrote in a field that nobody else was writing in, and that's the area of children's rights in canon law. And I started that doctorate, in 2014. Bear in mind, the Catholic Church had been under scrutiny in relation to its treatment of child victims of sexual abuse since the 1990s. And there was nothing, zilch, nada, going on in the leading Catholic university, which is the Pontifical Gregorian University, where I was a student. Nothing. When I went and I looked at the curriculum, not a mention of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, not a mention of the Convention on the Rights of the Child, incidentally to which the Catholic Church, the Holy See, was one of the earliest ratifiers. It was the 4th party to ratify, and is a state party to that convention, which guarantees children's rights. That was then. This is now. That was in 1990 they ratified it. And times have changed, and there's been so much pushback. And so instead of the Catholic Church saying, well, we ratified this, so now we should be taking that ratification process and applying it to canon law and saying, how can we make canon law respect our obligations under the convention? They've never done that. So I was the first person to even bother to look at this area. And then I remember at the time that I was telling, when I was setting out what I wanted to research for my doctorate, and my colleagues, actually my superiors in the university saying, well, there probably won't be much in it. Well, you could hold doors open with my book, it's that thick. And there was a lot in it that had gone unnoticed. So I then had to set about creating a cohort of scholars who would be interested in this area and would develop it. And so I'm very lucky that colleagues in America, and particularly in Germany and Switzerland, have become now very interested in this, and we held our first big conference on children's rights in the Catholic Church in Lucerne about 3 years ago now, Martin, it'll be about 3. And we're beginning slowly from nothing to develop a cohort of people who are, and I mean people who are educated across canon law, theology, and civil law, particularly human rights. That was what was missing. I was a civil lawyer who was educated in human rights law and then who became educated in canon law. And like there aren't very many of us. We're like a very small cohort, believe me. And so we had to try and develop theologians who were canon law literate, canon lawyers who were human rights literate, and we're only at the start of that now. So I have a lot of work to do, and I won't see it done in my lifetime. I'm too old now, but hopefully that cohort will gather momentum, and something that was completely overlooked will become a thing, I hope.
Wonderful, thank you very much. I would like to ask the audience, would any of you have any questions at all? Go.
Yes, just stand up.
Yes, please.
My name is Isabella. Thank you for being here. It's
A pleasure.
I wanted to ask actually on your last point. So I know it's slightly different with the legal entities of the Catholic Church and the Catholic Church itself, but how do you feel the energy is changing? Now we've had, Francis and even Pope Leo. How is this energy changing, maybe to be lesser in favor of what you're working towards?
I think that's a good question, what is happening in the Catholic Church, because I did mention the pushback. You see, back in the 1960s, when I was a teenager, the best thing that happened to the Catholic Church in the 20th century, and I will include the 21st century, was the election of a man called Pope John the 23rd. Now, he was supposed to be a stopgap pope. He was regarded as a bit of a buffoon, quite frankly. People thought he was, that he would never do much. But they didn't know where he had come from. In 1950, and I'll tell you the story of this because it's important to know the background, because you've asked about Francis and Leo, maybe, just to put you out of your misery, what's behind them and any dynamism that we see in relation to those questions, the teaching in relation to women, teaching in relation to human sexuality, teaching in relation to and I'll just backtrack on this in a minute, the teaching in human sexuality, and in particular things like abortion, but also particularly human reproduction and the use of contraception, which has been universally ignored by Catholics. That has created, and the other thing that has changed the dynamic, massification of second level education and massification of third level education, and in particular the education of women, that happened from the late 20th century onwards. They have changed the dynamic so that there is a huge population of lay people now within the Catholic Church who are more likely to critique, less likely to passively obey. They are now a wind at the back of Pope Francis, particularly, and Leo, pushing them in directions they mightn't want to go, but have to go in order to be able to appease to some extent or show they're listening. But to backtrack to John the 23rd, he, in 1950, was papal nuncio to France. 1950, the war had just ended, and leading intellectuals in Europe were saying, how in the name of God can we stop war from constantly being the default position of humanity, but particularly European humanity? And so four leading intellectuals who are also politicians, formed this idea for what we now call the European Union, for European nations to work together. They were Alcide de Gasperi from Italy. They were Jean Monnet and Robert Schuman and Konrad Adenauer. Those were the four. And they had this mad idea that Germany and France would work together, who hated each other. They had this mad idea that all the countries that had just fought the crap out of each other and killed 70 million of each other would stop doing that and actually work together for peace and prosperity. Where had the idea come from? Well, it was 1500 years old. It was first articulated by a man called Columbanus, a monk who arrived in post-Roman Empire Europe, where they were all fighting the crap out of each other. And he went round all the kingdoms, all these little petty vanities, and said, look lads, you want to keep fighting, but you're going to be going round in ever-decreasing circles, but if you actually want to have prosperity and stability, you're going to need to work together. And yes, you can be French, you can be Spanish, you can be Irish, you can be all these things, you can be German, but what about thinking in European terms? Creating a kind of a transformational, kind of transcendental almost place in which you bring all your sovereignties and you keep all your identities, but you create a supranational identity. And he created the phrase, first heard 1500 years ago, God help us all. It's not very encouraging actually. Totius Europe. These four intellectuals reared in that tradition knew of that story. They went to Luxeuil, where in the immediate aftermath of the war, Second World War, there was a big conference being held on St. Columbanus, and they met in secret in a hotel. And all the Allied leaders were there, including Winston Churchill, who's been named recently in other contexts. And all the Allied, Axis and neutral leaders were there, including the 4 members of the Irish government. And they met in secret, no minutes were kept. And these 4 men put this mad idea to see would it get any traction. Everybody bought into it. Who was at that meeting was the papal nuncio, who became John the 23rd. And he went away from that meeting knowing that if Europe was going to recalibrate its relationships so radically as it did, the Catholic Church was going to have to change too, which is why he announced, to complete consternation of his fellow bishops, the Second Vatican Council. So it was meant to be radical. You read the document that he thought would be the agenda. He talks about the emancipation of women. Women are going to come into their own. The document is called Pacem in Terris, Peace on Earth. The best thing written in the 20th century, apart from the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Does any Catholic know it? You must be joking. Completely overlooked, completely forgotten. He died, of course, before the end of the Second Vatican Council, and it lost a lot of its momentum. And the only momentum that was left afterwards was a group of people who were left to draft the 1983 Code of Canon Law. God help us, such a bunch of dullards. And that's what we got. We just got this desperate document that really needed updating the day it was produced, and still does. So I think the wind at the back of why we're seeing, there was a huge pushback from Pope John Paul. He was great on relations with Russia, and actually with the communist countries and the ending of communism. He was good for all that. Absolutely awful for more or less everything else. Paul VI, he gave us Humanae Vitae that nobody in his Holy Mother listened to. And he never wrote another document after that. He was so traumatized by the impact of that document. It's the one that banned contraception. There's actually some reasonably decent stuff in it, but that was not. And then you had, he was pretty passive as a pope. Paul VI with John Paul, who was, the happy, smiling, travelling pope, but was really ultra-conservative. And everything that he wrote about women was a disaster. And it was all it was the kind of what I would call fake theology in support of the reasons for excluding women. He developed a kind of a fake theology, I just call it codology dressed up as theology, to support the Church's teaching in relation to women and in relation to homosexuality. Pope Benedict, God bless him, the one good thing he did, and I've met him many times and really liked him as a human being, never agreed with anything he said, but liked him as a human being. He was can't say the same about John Paul. He was a very genuine man, and he did the decent thing by resigning when he realised he'd lost control, completely lost control. And then Francis, of course, who couldn't make head nor tail of, on the one hand and on the other hand. He'd say X, and then the next day, well, no, not really X, minus X. He would say things like, who am I to judge? And you'd say, hang on a minute, you're the Pope, you do judge. Have you read the stuff that you sit on, that you could change? And he never changed any of it. I liked where he went with some things, and then I didn't like where he went with other things. But the one thing that he did do, which I think he had a very long spoon and he stirred things up, and that was needed. I haven't got the measure of his successor yet. He's very quiet, different kind of person. Francis was very out there, The other guy isn't. He's much more quiet, and I don't know where he's going. I really don't know. Anything he has said on the subject of women and homosexuality, I have not liked. I have regarded it as, you know, back to basics and protective of old teaching. I liked what he said to people in the United States about those who were pro-abortion. Interestingly, he took them on, and he said, if you are, who are anti-abortion, sorry, he said to them, you know what, if you're anti-abortion, but you're also pro-capital punishment, just think on that and ask yourselves, is that not a very hypocritical stance? Now, the church in very recent years, only since John Paul, became committed to being opposed to capital punishment. Up to then it hadn't been. Up to then it had been very, you know, on the one hand and the other hand. But now, between Pope Francis and Pope John Paul, the church was adamantly anti-capital punishment. And along comes Leo, and he picked a fight that he didn't need to pick, because essentially it's with American fundamentalists and indeed American Catholics who make up a huge body of the anti-abortion, you know, pro-life lobby. And he said to them, I'm watching you, and this is hypocritical. Because actually the two, very often in the United States, do go hand in hand. You know, capital punishment and anti-abortion. So I thought he was good on that. I thought he was good on tackling the Trump administration on migrants. But those are, in some ways, I would say those are things that the church is used to. The Catholic Church, particularly the hierarchy, are very good at speaking out to the world. I think it was Ban Ki-moon who described the Catholic Church as having the moral pulpit of the world. And they use that to very good effect to speak out on many issues. What they're not so good at, historically, is taking that spotlight and turning it inwards to a position of self-critiquing. And that's what I think is needed. So where is the church going in relation to those things? Probably not in my lifetime. But I think that that the direction of travel, of glide, is being driven by a very educated laity now, who will not accept the inequalities, who will not accept the kind of hypocrisies and the vanities, and who'll keep challenging them, chipping them away, essentially, until we arrive at the true equality of women and a more educated and less ignorant view on human sexuality, and a whole bunch of other stuff as well.
Just have room for one last question. So if anyone... Go ahead.
Yeah, so a bit of a different theme, but just in relation to your perspective, because I don't think anyone else, or very few other people could give it. So you mentioned the relationship with the US and how difficult diplomacy in of itself is. And so I was just interested to hear your perspective on recent comments from Catherine Connolly, who condemned the US and Israeli actions in relation to Iran as contrary to international law, which, and I'd like to state, is correct. But I think in terms of the role of the president as a constitutional figurehead rather than an active politician, and in terms of managing dynamics with the US relationship, while trying to maintain an allegiance to values of dignity, of human rights, of fundamental respect, of international law, how do you think President of Ireland and Iran should manage that? And what did you make of those comments and the dynamics in which they exist?
It's interesting because the Constitution of Ireland, we've written Constitution, as you know, which is a very helpful document, and it does set out the role of the president. Like all documents, like all constitutions, it's broad brush. I'm not going to get a lot of nitty-gritty. But what is interesting is that in relation to the president's speeches, particularly on stuff that is, of national or particularly international importance, or that might cut across the role of government, it is the case that the president, very often that the speeches would have to be essentially vetted by the government. So I don't know if that happened this time around. I presume that it possibly did. I know that when I was in office, there were occasions on which, now, I was talking here, I was talking to school, or I was doing 40 speeches as I have done on circuits. They don't all go into government. But certainly if you're going to speak on something that is quite monumental, it would be advisable to run it past government. I don't know if that was done. I presume it was on this occasion. But every president, has their own dynamic and has their own agenda to a certain extent. Now, a lot of that agenda is set by the Constitution. And I think anybody who would have seen Catherine's, the President's agenda before she became President would know that she had very strong opinions on these kind of matters. And so it wouldn't be no surprise to hear that. Her predecessor the same. And I had my day saying what I had to say, Mary Robinson the same. We all had our opportunity. And that's the nature of, I think that's the nature of the Irish presidency, is that you do have a platform to, I'm not sure that we can change things through that platform, but nonetheless you can contribute to the debate, and we have that freedom. We are currently in a major, I think a crisis of debate on this issue. And I don't know if any of you have seen I think it came out in 2019, that sort of docudrama called Official Secret. Anybody has seen that? Mm-hmm. I recommend it strongly because it really is foursquare on where we're at the moment. It is the background to the Iraq War, for which there was no legitimacy whatsoever. So-called weapons of mass destruction didn't exist. The intelligence fabricated, and awful Machiavellian stuff done by both the UK government and the US government. This is all documented by the UK's government's own investigation into awful stuff. Mm-hmm. But in the middle of it all, back in 2003, I think I'm right on the date, as the momentum was building towards, post 9/11, the momentum was building towards an attack on Iraq by the United States, but wanting to be in coalition, the so-called coalition of the willing, essentially with the United Kingdom and Spain, with Jose Aznar and Tony Blair and George Bush. And a young woman working for the MOD, or anyway, it was one of the service agencies for which you have to take the Official Secrets Act. She came across as an interpreter and a translator, this young woman in her 20s. She came across a document that indicated utterly Machiavellian practices to try, and the United Nations had turned down an application by the United States for the United Nations to vindicate and to approve an attack on Iraq. So that left the coalition of the willing in some difficulty, and they were trying now for a second attempt at the United Nations, but they tried to. They were actually trying behind the scenes to manipulate that second vote. And this document, it was an email from a very senior United States military person, set out actually what they were going to do to really queer the pitch, essentially. And she saw that, and she also was hearing Tony Blair saying that they now had clear evidence of weapons of mass destruction, when this document says, because we haven't got that evidence, we're going to have to manufacture a different way around this. And she couldn't live with that, so she passed it on to an anti-war person, who passed it on to a journalist. The Observer then carried it, and then she ended up in court, charged with breach of the Official Secrets Act. And of course, she's a brilliant lawyer, and utterly played by Ralph Fiennes. That's the nice part. Brilliant lawyer who came up with a brilliant tactic, because she confessed. She went into her employers when they were going through all her colleagues. She just walked in and said, "It was me. I handed it over. And so they thought they had a confession. And she said, yeah, I confessed to handing over the document, but I'm not confessing to breaching the Official Secrets Act, because the Official Secrets Act exists to protect the British public. And although I'm employed by whatever it was, the MOD or whatever the organisation was, my obligation is not to a government. My obligation is to the people, and to ensure that they are not betrayed by their government or lied to, which they were being, by their own Prime Minister. And I'm saying that as somebody who has a huge respect for Tony Blair. Why? Because he, helped us get the Good Friday Agreement, which brought us the peace that we have. And, I would never take that away from him. But anyway, she goes into court, and the presumption is she will plead guilty, which she doesn't. And then she pleads not guilty, and the presumption is she'd be easily found guilty, because there's the confession. But her lawyer decides to run with the defence of necessity, which means calling Tony Blair, calling the former Attorney General, Lord Goldsmith, who first of all was against the war and said it was illegal, and then suddenly changed his mind. But he had a document from his number 2, a 30-page document setting out the reasons why it was illegal. He changes his mind, she resigns quietly. But now the prosecution are being asked for the document, but of course they can't. Under no circumstances can they release that document. They're now in full war mode. It's 2004, and they can't. So prosecution stand up and say, we're withdrawing the charges. The judge nearly has a heart attack. How come? And the answer is because we have no faith in our ability to achieve a successful prosecution. Oh, wow. So she gets off. She doesn't just get off. She walks away, and completely vindicated, utterly vindicated. And all the dirty tricks that were done, because her husband was a Kurdish Turk who they tried to deport. I mean, really ugly. There's a lot of ugly stuff goes on, when you declare war. War machinations are ugly, and they bring out the worst in human nature. And frankly, I think humanity's default position always seems to be argumentation, conflict and violence. And yet there's an impulse in another side of humanity for peace, for consensus, for compromise. We saw that in the Good Friday Agreement, and that's the one we want to encourage. So, do I think that the war on Iran, declared by President Trump, was legal? No, I don't. Do I think it has provoked an appalling situation in the Middle East? I don't know where this ends. I don't know how this ends. When I was 18, war broke out in my street in Belfast, just a mile or two up the road. And I thought it would last a week. And then I thought it would last a month. And then I thought it would last a year. And then it lasted 30 goddamn years. Because I don't know when it ends. I think when the genie's out of the bottle, it's appalling. And I think anybody who calls us back and reminds us that we do have a thing called the rule of law, we do have international treaties, we do have ways of dealing with conflict situations, and we do have rules around diplomacy and rules around the rule of law, and we expect the world's leading democracies to observe them, and we hope they will. And when they don't, it's heartbreaking. So yeah, I think that we're in that dilemma at the moment. You can see the pressure that's being put on Keir Starmer, to get involved, and he's saying, that he has a duty to the British public to see that whatever they do operates within the rule of law. I mean, he's a lawyer, a former DPP. It's really very, very difficult, extravagantly difficult. And for those who are living in the Middle East, and I have a daughter living there, we have a daughter living there, and she was in Bahrain 2 weeks ago, when staying right beside the American base, and she wasn't at the American base, she was just staying beside it, and her hotel suddenly became flooded by young American soldiers who were completely labile about the fact that they were about to attack Iran. And she wrote to me and she said, whatever happened to operational secrecy? These guys were completely open about it, gung-ho, and she couldn't wait to get out of Bahrain because she said, well, if they're going to attack this weekend, no doubt that they will be attacked in return. We need to get out of here. So they got out of Bahrain back home to where they live in the Emirates, never thinking that the Emirates would be hit. You know, so stuff happens that people can't predict. And then the unpredictable keeps happening, you know. Our daughter lives in a high-rise, and we tried to persuade her to go stay with in-laws who have a regular house, and I'm glad we didn't, because their house was right beside a hotel that burnt to the ground. Well, it didn't burn to the ground, but got burnt because it was attacked and the missile was intercepted, but the debris from that intercept, which was successful, caused a fire. And you know, from here to there, out of their back garden, just looking across the street, you're looking at the hotel. So she wouldn't have been safe there. We thought she would have been, but she wouldn't have been. So who knows? Who knows? War's been loosed. The dogs of war are very, very hard to put manners on. And I admire anybody who tries to remind us that peace is humanly decent and war is not.
I would like to invite the events officer up to the floor just to make a couple of final announcements.
Thank you, Daniel.
Good morning, Dr. Dan, and thank you all for coming here. I really think it is, I'm quite glad this mic works as well. I think it really is a testament to public dialogue that a student society can have a former president of Ireland addressing them. I really think that's a powerful thing, and I think that all of us here can be proud of that fact. I'd like to reflect just on your last comment on war. It is peace that brings an end to war, and importantly, it is dialogue that brings an important end to war. And what we are doing here, reflects that. Of course, we're all conscious of our past here in Northern Ireland, and it is good that we are at the point where we can have these discussions, and more importantly, that it is students leading them. I'm also glad to say that two of the people you mentioned in your speech, we have hosted here at the LitTalk in recent times. We had Daniel Rankin just 2 weeks ago, and Theresa May last year. I'd like to give you all just a brief update on future LitTalks, if you may allow me. On the 30th of March, we have Sam McBride, the editor, the Northern Ireland editor of the Belfast Telegraph. Then afterwards, we have another journalist, Peter Taylor. That's on the 13th of April. Of course, a veteran journalist at the BBC, who covered a bunch of the Troubles. That'll be a great one. On the 20th of April, then a week after, we have the current Speaker of the Assembly, Edmund Poots of the DUP. That'll be an interesting one, and we are looking forward to everything that the Society has to offer, and we really do hope that you will join us. And I invite our current President, Daniel Rankin, to adjourn the House. Thank you, Daniel.
Dr. McAleese, it has been our pleasure to welcome you back to Queen's University Belfast, and we thank you for your contributions to what's been an incredibly insightful discussion tonight. What you've outlined are three key materials that any architect of peace requires to build bridges. QUB. Questioning one's own beliefs, understanding the perspectives of others, and being a part of that conversation so you can reach a compromise. These are three fundamental building blocks which we pride ourselves on having at the Literary and Scientific Society, and provide strong foundations for our future. And for your contributions tonight, Dr. McAleese, it would be my privilege to award you as a token of our Society's appreciation with a Litterific pin badge. Thank you. And finally, thank yous are in order. We want to thank the Vice Chancellor's Office and Dr. Ryan Feeney for their involvement in the event, to our events officer, James Turish, to our interviewer, Daniel Rankin,
Well done.
co-editor of The Go, and once again, on behalf of the House, a massive thank you to former President of Ireland, Dr. Mary McAleese. Thank you. I'm incredibly proud to call this event adjourned.